I woke up from a year-long coma to find an HOA had built 193 vacation cabins on my private land. The new HOA president handed me a deed with my own signature on it, dated just 3 weeks after my heart stopped. He thought he'd stolen my life's work, but he didn't realize he built his entire illegal resort on a catastrophic floodplain, right in the shadow of a dam that I built with my own 2 hands. So when the law failed me, I was left with one impossible choice: let him win, or open the gates and let gravity handle the rest. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because you're about to see what true justice looks like. The first breath I took felt like swallowing fire and ice. It scraped its way down a throat that didn't feel like my own, past a plastic tube they pulled out just hours before. The air in the room was sterile, tasting of bleach and something vaguely sweet, like wilting flowers. My eyes fluttered open to a world that was too bright, too white. A machine next to me beeped a steady, reassuring rhythm that I somehow knew was my own heart, back from a long, quiet trip. I saw my daughter, Casey, slumped in a chair by the window. She looked older, not by a day or two, but by a hard-worn year. There were new lines around her eyes, and her shoulders had a permanent slump to them that wasn't there before. She'd been a paramedic, used to carrying the weight of others, but this was different. This was the weight of waiting. When she saw my eyes were open, she shot up straight, her own eyes wide with a mix of shock and a joy so fierce it looked like pain. She gripped my hand, her skin warm against mine. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad, can you hear me?" I tried to answer, but my mouth was a desert and my tongue felt like a foreign object. All I could manage was a dry, rasping sound. She understood anyway, tears streaming down her face as she squeezed my hand tighter. "It's okay," she whispered. "Don't try to talk. Just rest." The doctor came in, then a nurse. They spoke in low, calm tones, but the words they used were heavy. Heart attack. Coma. 13 months. A full year and then some. Just gone. Wiped from the slate. The last thing I remembered was the sharp, clean scent of burning leaves in my yard. It was April, and the dogwoods were just starting to bloom. Now, the calendar on the wall said it was late May, a year later. My life, my land, my work, everything had been left unattended for over 400 days. The days that followed were a blur of soft foods, physical therapy, and the slow, agonizing process of learning to speak again. My body, once strong from decades of engineering work and hauling materials, felt like a stranger's. I was a 68-year-old man, trapped in the frame of someone 20 years older. Casey was my rock. She'd sit with me for hours, showing me pictures on her phone, telling me stories about her work, and turning on the local news in the afternoons to fill the silence. It was mostly just noise to me, a background hum while I focused on lifting a spoon to my mouth or forming a simple word. But one afternoon, the noise sharpened into a clear, chilling picture. A local news segment started, one of those Missouri on the Move pieces, about new development and economic growth. The screen filled with sweeping drone footage. It soared over a pristine lake, its surface like polished glass under the spring Sunday. I knew that shoreline. I knew the way the 3 ancient oaks stood guard on the western bank, the exact curve where the water deepened over a submerged granite shelf. It was my lake. The reservoir I'd spent the better part of a decade building with my own 2 hands. But something was horribly wrong. The camera panned, and where my untouched 400 acres of forest and private access roads should have been, there was a sprawling, modern resort. Dozens of identical, prefabricated cabins were packed together, their shiny metal roofs glinting in the Sunday freshly laid gravel roads snaked between them like gray scars on the land. And right at the entrance, a massive, professionally carved wooden sign stood proud and defiant. It read, Lakeview Club Estates. Below it, in smaller letters, a private HOA community. The reporter's voice chirped on about luxury vacation rentals and boosting local tourism. I just stared, my spoon clattering onto the plastic tray. My mind, still fuzzy from the coma, struggled to connect the dots. An HOA? On my land? The land my grandfather had bought 60 years ago, deeded solely to me, with no easements, no liens, no partners. It was impossible. That, I croaked, the word tearing at my raw throat. That looks like my damn land. Casey looked up from her magazine, startled by my voice. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. She quickly reached for the remote, but I put my hand on her arm to stop her. It was a weak gesture, but it was enough. My eyes were locked on the television. The drone shot zoomed in on the dam. I knew every bolt, every pour of concrete, every relief valve on that structure. But now, new electrical lines were strung carelessly over the main wall, and a cheaply built viewing platform had been bolted onto the side. A clear violation of every safety code I knew. The reporter mentioned the chairman of this new development, a man named Thomas Ridge, who was bringing affordable luxury to the area. The name rang a faint, sour bell. I'd met a developer by that name years ago, a slick talker who wanted to buy my lakefront property. He'd offered a fraction of what it was worth, talking about partnerships and community benefits. I'd told him, politely but firmly, to get lost. My land wasn't for sale. It was my legacy, my retirement, my peace. Now, it seemed he'd come back while I was asleep and simply took it. The news segment ended with a final glorious shot of the cabins nestled by the water, a perfect picture of progress. The room felt cold. The steady beeping of the heart monitor seemed to mock me. A slow, rising dread, colder than any fear I'd felt in Vietnam, began to creep into my veins. This wasn't just a mistake or a boundary dispute. This was a hostile takeover. This was theft on a massive scale. I turned my head to look at Casey. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and she was chewing on her lower lip, a nervous habit she'd had since she was a little girl. She knew. She'd known this whole time. My voice came out quiet, but it was as hard as the bedrock my dam was built on. Casey, I asked, trying to keep my breathing even, who gave them permission to build that? She didn't answer right away. She just stared at the worn linoleum, and in that long, heavy silence, I felt the ground shift beneath my whole world. The look on her face wasn't just sadness or confusion. It was guilt. It was the face of someone who was holding a terrible secret, and I knew, right then, that my fight was just beginning. Getting home from the hospital felt like landing on a different planet. The two-lane country road I'd driven my whole life now had a new, gaudy entrance carved into its side, about a quarter mile before my own driveway. A polished log archway read, Lakeview Club Estates. Just like the sign on the news. They hadn't just built on my land, they'd rerouted the access. My own driveway felt smaller, like a service entrance. Casey pushed my wheelchair up the ramp we'd had installed. I was weak, unsteady, but my mind was getting sharper by the day, and it was buzzing with a cold, clear anger. The first thing I saw when we got inside was the mountain of mail piled on the dining room table. Casey had been collecting it. My old mailbox at the end of the drive was gone, replaced by a bank of community mailboxes near their fancy new entrance. Hers was a small stack of personal letters and bills. Mine was a fortress of official-looking envelopes. For an hour, I sat there in my wheelchair, just opening them, one after another. Red tag notices from the Lakeview Architectural Review Committee fining me $200 for unmaintained lawn appearance. A formal warning for an unapproved structure, my 40-year-old tool shed. A property tax bill that had tripled, reassessed under a new commercial zoning code, and dozens of letters from the HOA, each one colder and more demanding than the last, citing bylaws I'd never seen and rules I'd never agreed to. I was a stranger on my own property, a tenant being served with eviction papers from a landlord who had no right to be there. Finally, when the pile of threatening paper surrounded me like a barricade, I looked at Casey. The guilt was practically rolling off her in waves. "I didn't know what to do, Dad," she started, her voice trembling. I went to a lawyer right after I found the first construction notice. He told me it was airtight. He said fighting it would cost a fortune, and with you, well, he said I had no power of attorney to challenge it. I just nodded slowly, letting her talk. She went to the hall closet and pulled out a heavy 3-ring binder. She placed it on the table in front of me with a thud. "I found this a few months ago," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was filed with the county clerk's office." I opened the binder. The first page was a copy of a notarized deed transfer. My land, all 400 acres, including the reservoir and the dam, transferred to a company called Environmental Residential Partnership LLC. The date on the document was May 12 of last year. Exactly 3 weeks after I'd been admitted to the hospital. 3 weeks after I'd fallen into a coma. And at the bottom of the page, in the space for the grantor's signature, was my name, William Langston. My hand shook as I traced the signature with my finger. It was a good forgery. A very good one. The slant was right, the pressure on the pen was close. But it wasn't mine. "The penmanship is close," I said, my voice low and steady. "But I don't curl my L's like that." I flipped through the pages. The deed granted this LLC full use and build rights. The filing was stamped and approved by the county clerk, a man I'd known for 30 years. It all looked painfully official. It was a paper cage, built to be unbreakable. The name of the manager listed for the LLC was Thomas Ridge. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door locking. I remembered him clearly now. The cheap suit, the too white smile. He had walked my property line with me 5 years ago, talking about unlocking its potential. He'd offered me cash, a small fortune for a man like me, but I didn't care about the money. I'd looked him in the eye and told him there were some things that couldn't be bought. He didn't take it well. He'd left with a look on his face that wasn't just disappointment, it was offense. The look of a man who couldn't stand being told no. He couldn't buy my land, so while I was lying helpless in a hospital bed, he simply had it stolen for him, hiding behind a corporate front and a forged signature. The betrayal was a physical thing, a cold weight in my chest. Not just from Ridge, but from the system that had allowed it to happen so easily. The confusion was gone now. The dread was gone. In its place, a quiet, methodical resolve started to form, solid as concrete. I felt the engineer in me waking up, the part of me that doesn't see problems, only systems. Systems that can be understood, and systems that can be broken. I looked up at Casey. Her face was streaked with tears. "It's okay," I told her, and for the first time in a year, I sounded like myself. "You did your best. Now it's my turn." I asked her to push my wheelchair outside. We went out onto the back porch, the one I'd built overlooking the reservoir. I could hear the faint sounds of construction from across the lake, the whine of saws and the beep 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 of a truck backing up. I stared at the dam, my dam. I knew its tensile strength, its flow rate, its tolerances. I knew the weight of every cubic foot of water it held back. Ridge and his lawyers had built their case on paper and lies. I had built my legacy on rock and physics. A small smile touched my lips. He had made a fatal engineering mistake. "Gravity always wins," I muttered, mostly to myself. You can't vote against gravity. The first week back, my world was the view from my porch. I spent hours out there, a pair of old military binoculars in my lap, just watching, counting. 193 of them. Little cookie-cutter cabins, crammed onto my land like ticks on a dog. They were cheap, prefab things, thrown up in a hurry. From a distance they looked impressive, but through the binoculars, I could see the truth. The gravel roads they'd cut were already showing signs of washout from a single spring rain. The electric lines drooped carelessly from pole to pole, a clear fire hazard in the dry season. Each cabin had a small, white septic tank cover in its yard. Placed so close together, I knew they hadn't done proper percolation tests. It was a disaster waiting to happen, built by someone who cared about speed and profit, not safety or skill. That man was Thomas Ridge. He now called himself the chairman of the Lakeview Club Estates. I found his smug face all over their new website, talking about his vision for community. He was a former county building inspector, which explained a lot. He knew exactly which rules to bend and which permits to rush. He knew the system's weaknesses because he used to be one of its gatekeepers, a wolf who'd been put in charge of the sheep. My investigation started not with lawyers, but with public records. I couldn't walk into the county clerk's office, but I could guide Casey. I made a list, simple and direct. I told her to file a public information request for every single document related to the Environmental Residential Partnership and the Lakeview Club Estates. I wanted emails, applications, meeting minutes, inspection reports, everything. A week later, she came home with a thick manila folder. They weren't very happy about it, she said, setting the stack on the table. The clerk kept saying the documents were all in order. We spent that evening sorting through the paper, piece by piece. The first red flag was the HOA's original application to the city. It was sloppy. They'd failed to include a full land ownership verification. Instead, they'd attached a copy of their LLC registration, and the city had apparently accepted it without question. It was a corner cut, a small act of laziness that had opened the door for everything else. But the real dynamite was buried deeper in the file. It was a chain of emails between Thomas Ridge and the county clerk, a man I'd shared coffee with at the local diner for 2 decades. The request Casey filed had snagged all correspondence mentioning my property's parcel number. Ridge had written to the clerk just days after my heart attack. The subject line was, "Urgent. ERP land transfer." I read the words, and a cold fire started burning in my gut. Ridge's email was polite on the surface, but the message was pure poison. He wrote, "Just push it through. The owner is incapacitated. No heirs who can contest. This project has significant community backing. No heirs." He was talking about Casey. He'd erased her, erased me, erased my entire family with a single sentence. The clerk's one-line reply came 10 minutes later. "We'll process this morning." It was a conspiracy, plain and simple, executed in public emails that they never thought anyone would look for. My methodical calm began to fray. The anger I felt wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and heavy, like a block of iron. This wasn't just a forgery anymore. This was a calculated attack by a man who saw me as an obstacle to be removed. He didn't just want my land. He wanted me gone, legally and literally. I gripped the arms of my wheelchair, my knuckles white. They thought they had me. They thought the old man in the hospital bed was finished. They were wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wheeled myself into my small office, the one room in the house that hadn't been touched by time. I unlocked the heavy, gray, fireproof cabinet in the corner, the one where I kept the important things: blueprints, deeds, land surveys going back to my grandfather's time. I pulled out my original topographical survey map, the one I'd commissioned myself 30 years ago. I unrolled it on my desk, the paper crisp and familiar. It showed every contour, every creek bed, every drainage channel on my 400 acres. Using a ruler and a red pen, I began to plot the coordinates of the new cabins based on a satellite printout from Casey's computer. My hands were slow, but they were steady. And as the red dots filled the map, the picture became terrifyingly clear. Ridge hadn't just built on my land. He'd built on the floodplain. His precious vacation resort sat directly on top of 2 natural wetland runoffs and cut right across a protected watershed boundary I'd registered with the state myself. He had packed those cabins into the lowest lying area, the exact spot where water was naturally supposed to go during a heavy rain. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the map. The legal battle over the forged deed was one thing. That was a fight of words and lawyers. This was a fight of physics. A fight I knew how to win. I ran my finger along the blue line that marked the reservoir. They didn't just build on my land. They built on the floodplain. The next morning, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. An old voice answered on the second ring, gravelly and impatient. "Morales." "Reggie." "It's Bill Langston," I said. There was a pause. "Well, I'll be," Reggie said, his tone softening slightly. "Heard you were out of commission." "Good to hear your voice, Bill." Reggie Morales and I went way back to the Army Corps of Engineers. He was the best drainage engineer I ever knew. A man who could look at a piece of land and tell you where a drop of rain would end up a mile away. "I need a favor, Reggie," I said, getting straight to it. "I've got a drainage problem, a big one. I need a state-certified expert to put a pair of eyes on it." Quietly. There was no hesitation. "When and where?" he asked. The righteous fire in my gut burned a little brighter. The pieces were coming together. The plan was forming. Reggie Morales arrived at 5 in the morning, just as the sky was turning from black to a bruised purple. He drove an old Ford pickup that rumbled with the same low, steady confidence as the man himself. He didn't waste time with small talk. He stepped out of the cab, a heavy-duty clipboard in one hand and a thermos in the other, and gave my property a long, slow look. "You weren't kidding, Bill," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "They put up a whole town." I was already in my all-terrain wheelchair, the one with the rugged tires that could handle the dirt paths. Casey had helped me get ready. She stood on the porch, a worried look on her face, holding a camera. I'd asked her to document everything. We set out at first light, 2 old soldiers going on a reconnaissance mission. Reggie didn't look at the cabins. He looked at the ground beneath them. He walked the newly cut roads, kicking at the loose gravel. He knelt by the concrete footings of a retaining wall that was supposed to be holding back a small slope. He ran his hand over the surface, then pointed to a hairline crack already spider-webbing near the base. "No rebar cages," he grunted. "They just poured cheap concrete into a wooden frame. See the water stain? It's already weeping." He was methodical, quiet, taking notes on his clipboard and telling Casey what pictures to take. We found the source of a foul smell behind a row of cabins, an open trench where gray water pipes from the kitchens and showers were draining directly into the soil. Less than 50 feet from a natural creek that fed my reservoir. It was illegal, lazy, and dangerous. We moved from one violation to the next. Unpermitted trenching that had severed the roots of century-old oaks. Propane tanks installed too close to electrical junction boxes. Downspouts that channeled roof runoff directly against the cabin's foundations, a textbook invitation for erosion and mold. It was a city of shortcuts. Reggie stopped at the base of the steepest slope, where about 20 cabins were clustered together with a view of the lake. He pointed his pen at the hillside above them. "Look there," he said. The land had been aggressively clear-cut. The raw, red Missouri clay was exposed, with nothing but a thin layer of straw to hold it in place. "This isn't just illegal," he said, turning to face me. His face was grim. "It's unstable. One good spring rain, a real gully washer, and half these cabins slide right into your lake." His words hung in the air, confirming the cold dread I'd felt when I first looked at my survey map. He'd seen in 30 minutes what their crooked inspectors had ignored for a year. The problem was proving it wasn't just a mistake, but a deliberate choice. The proof, I realized, was already waiting for me. I'd set up a few motion-activated trail cams years ago, hoping to get pictures of deer and turkey. After I got home, Casey had retrieved the memory cards for me. I had assumed the batteries would be dead, but one of them, overlooking the main access road, had held its charge. That night, I plugged the card into my computer. The images that loaded were time-stamped, mostly from the dead of night. Headlights cutting through the darkness. Unmarked dump trucks rolling in at 2 in the morning. Private contractors, not in official company trucks, working under portable floodlights, rushing to pour concrete and frame walls before sunrise. Ridge was building his resort in the shadows, moving too fast for any honest inspector to keep up. This was the start of my real work. Over the next 2 weeks, my small office became a command center. I pulled the water flow logs from the electronic sensors on my dam. For 40 years, they showed a predictable pattern of seasonal highs and lows. But starting last May, the logs showed massive erratic spikes in water, turbidity and runoff, evidence of uncontrolled construction erosion, all time-stamped. Next, I went to Google Earth. For a small subscription fee, I could access their historical satellite imagery. I saved an image of my pristine, forested land from the month before my heart attack. Then I pulled the images from every month I was in a coma. It was like watching a disease spread in fast motion. The forest vanished, the red dirt appeared, and the cabins popped up one by one. The satellite doesn't lie. The final piece came from Casey, who had a knack for digging online. She found a public record of liens filed against Ridge's Personal LLC, the parent company for his environmental residential partnership, by a local gravel supplier. She managed to get copies of the invoices. The delivery slips listed my property's coordinates, not by address, but by the legal parcel number, for nighttime material dumps that matched the timestamps on my trail cam photos perfectly. He hadn't even bothered to hide the money trail. He was arrogant. He thought no one was looking. I took all of it, Reggie's signed and notarized field report, the trail cam photos, the dam sensor logs, the satellite images, and the invoices, and I put it all into a thick black binder. On the cover, I printed a simple title in bold white letters. Before you say it's legal. This was my weapon. Not a gun, but a story told in facts and figures. A case so airtight no lawyer could tear it apart. I was just putting the final page in its plastic sleeve when Casey walked in with the day's mail. She handed me a crisp, white envelope. It was from a big law firm downtown. I tore it open. It was a formal notice. It accused me of trespassing on the property of Lakeview Club Estates and demanded I cease and desist all interference and surveillance activities immediately. They were watching me. The bully knew he was being watched, and he was trying to hit back first. The notice from Ridge's lawyers was a declaration of war. It was also an invitation. They had scheduled an open HOA meeting in 2 days to address what they called malicious rumors about the development's land titles. They were trying to get ahead of the story, to control the narrative and paint me as a confused old man causing trouble. They had no idea I was about to bring the truth to their front door, gift-wrapped in a 3-ring binder. The meeting was held in the clubhouse they'd built near the new entrance, a building that still smelled of fresh paint and cut corners. Casey pushed my wheelchair through the double doors into a room buzzing with tension. It was packed. At least 100 cabin owners were crammed into folding chairs, their faces a mixture of anger, confusion, and fear. These weren't villains. They were people who had bought into Ridge's dream, retirees and families who had sunk their savings into a vacation home. And now, they were hearing whispers that the very ground beneath their feet was stolen. Casey found us a spot near the back. She propped her phone up discreetly on her lap, aimed it at the podium, and hit record. Thomas Ridge stood at the front, flanked by a slick-looking lawyer. He wore an expensive suit and a practiced smile, but I could see the tightness around his eyes. He started the meeting with a flood of reassuring words: community, partnership, shared vision. He dismissed the rumors as a simple clerical error that was being sorted out. He told them their investments were safe, their titles secure. The crowd grumbled, but they listened. They wanted to believe him. When he finished his speech, he asked if there were any questions. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the back of the room, my voice, amplified by the quiet tension, cut through the air. I have one. Every head turned. The room went dead silent as I began to wheel myself slowly down the center aisle. The sound of the chair's electric motor was the only thing you could hear. Ridge's smile faltered. His lawyer whispered something in his ear. I stopped right in front of the podium, the heavy black binder resting on my lap. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, then I looked directly at Ridge. "My name is Bill Langston," I said, my voice clear and steady. "This development is built on my land." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Ridge grabbed the microphone. "Now, hold on," he boomed, his voice falsely jovial. "This is exactly the kind of misinformation I was talking about. Sir, you are confused. We have a legally executed deed." I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not confused," I said calmly. "I'm a hydro engineer. I spent 40 years of my life on this land. I built that reservoir you're selling tickets to with my own 2 hands. Every bolt, every rock, and I know every rule you broke to put these cabins here." With that, I lifted the heavy binder and dropped it onto the table in front of him. The thud echoed through the microphone. "Before you say it's legal," I said, my eyes locked on his, "you might want to look at this." I opened it to the first page and turned it so the crowd could see the enlarged copy of the forged deed, side by side with a dozen examples of my real signature. Next to it was the notarized analysis from a court-certified handwriting expert, concluding mine was a forgery. A gasp went through the crowd. I flipped the page. "This is a satellite image of my land from April of last year. Forest." I flipped again. "This is from June. A clear-cut scar." Another flip. "And this is the land today." I turned to the water permit maps. "You built this resort on a designated floodplain, in direct violation of state environmental codes." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts were doing the shouting for me. I presented Reggie's report, with pictures of the cracking foundations and illegal drainage. I showed them the timestamps from my trail cams, proof of contractors working in the dead of night to avoid inspectors. The room erupted. People shot to their feet, shouting, not at me, but at Ridge. "You said we had full easement rights," one man yelled. "You told me the land was donated to the county," a woman cried out, her voice breaking. "My cabin's foundation is already cracking." Ridge's face had gone from a healthy tan to a pasty white. He grabbed the microphone again, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a lie. He's a disgruntled old man trying to sabotage affordable housing. He was losing them, and he knew it." He started babbling about lawsuits, about me trying to extort the community. The crowd wasn't buying it. They had the evidence right in front of them, a story told in black and white. I just sat there, quiet, and let him unravel. I had done my part. I didn't want revenge. I wanted gravity to speak. When the shouting finally died down and Ridge's lawyer had shuffled him out of a side door, I wheeled myself out into the cool evening air. The chaos I'd left behind wasn't my concern. The next morning, Casey drove me to the county courthouse. I didn't file a lawsuit. I filed something much simpler. It was a single-page document, an official notice of revocation of all implied easements on my property, citing multiple, documented environmental and building code non-compliances. It was a legal move, quiet and precise. It meant that, effective in 48 hours, every road, every water line, and every electrical cable that crossed my land to service their 193 cabins would constitute an active, prosecutable act of trespassing. The paper cage they had built was about to fall apart. Their city of shortcuts was about to be cut off. The 48-hour clock started ticking. Just as I expected, Ridge didn't take it lying down. His lawyers filed for an emergency injunction the very next morning, trying to stop my easement revocation. It was a desperate, panicked move. We met before a judge in a small, stuffy courtroom. Ridge was there, looking pale and sleep-deprived. His lawyer argued that my action would cause irreparable harm to the 193 families who owned cabins. He painted me as a vengeful old man holding innocent people hostage. When it was my turn, my lawyer didn't argue emotion. He simply presented the facts. He handed the judge a copy of my binder. He pointed to the forged deed, the illegal construction on a designated floodplain, and the official state-certified report from Reggie Morales, detailing the imminent danger of landslides. He calmly stated that the irreparable harm had already been done by Mr. Ridge, and that my client, Mr. Langston, was simply acting to protect his own property and prevent an environmental disaster. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, spent 20 minutes reading through Reggie's report. She didn't look up once. When she was done, she closed the binder, looked over her glasses at Ridge's lawyer, and said 5 words that ended the fight before it began. Emergency injunction denied. Next case. Ridge practically stumbled out of the courtroom. The law had looked at the facts and refused to protect him. His paper cage was gone. That afternoon, another domino fell. The county's chief floodplain inspector, a man I'd never met, called me directly. He had received a copy of my filings and had driven out to the site himself, Mr. Langston. He said, his voice tired but firm, "I've just posted stop work orders on the entire development, acting on the evidence you and Mr. Agrid Morales provided. I am declaring all 193 structures officially non-compliant with county and state floodplain regulations. They're unsafe. Period." The final piece was in place. It was no longer just my opinion. It was the official, legal position of the county government. They had built an illegal resort, and now everyone knew it. That night, the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle spring shower. It was the first real seasonal storm of the year. A classic Missouri downpour that hammered on the roof and turned the world outside into a gray, watery blur. I sat on my porch, listening to the rain, watching the water level in my reservoir slowly begin to rise. The sensors I monitored on my computer showed the inflow from the surrounding hills was increasing steadily. This wasn't an act of God. It was a predictable seasonal event, one I had managed for 40 years. My dam's operational manual, which was on file with the state, clearly stated the protocol. During a heavy rainfall event, when the reservoir level reaches a certain point, the secondary sluice gates are to be opened to relieve hydrostatic pressure and manage downstream flow. It wasn't a choice. It was my legal and engineering duty. At midnight, the alarm on my computer chimed softly. The water level had hit the mark. I put on my old yellow raincoat, pulled my rubber boots on, and wheeled myself out into the storm. Casey stood by the door, watching me, her face a mask of worry. I just gave her a small nod. I knew what I was doing. The path to the dam's control house was slick with mud, but my chair handled it. Inside the small concrete building, the air was dry and smelled of oil and metal. I flipped on the lights and went through the checklist, just as I had 1,000 times before. Checked the pressure gauges, logged the water level. Then, I walked over to the manual control wheel for gate number 2. It was heavy, made of cast iron, and painted bright red. I gripped it with both hands. It was legal. It was necessary. It was protocol. With a slow, steady effort, I began to turn the wheel. There was a deep, groaning sound from below as the 1-ton steel gate began to rise, inch by inch. I wasn't opening it all the way, just enough to follow the book. I was releasing a controlled, steady stream of water into the natural runoff channel, the very same floodplain that Ridge had built his entire resort on top of. I didn't destroy anything. I just let nature remember where the water goes. The effect wasn't a tidal wave. It was slow, quiet, and relentless. For the next few hours, I watched from my porch. First, the cheap gravel roads turned to mush, then rivers of mud. The hastily dug trenches for the utility lines flooded, and soon the power to the entire resort flickered and died. Then the water, having nowhere else to go, began to pool around the foundations of the cabins on the lowest ground. It saturated the unstable, clear-cut soil. I heard a deep, groaning sound carry across the water, the sound of wet earth giving way. One cabin, perched on the edge of the steepest slope, began to shift. It moved just an inch at first, then a foot. Then, with a horrible screech of tortured wood and popping nails, it began to slide, slowly and unstoppably, down the muddy embankment. It came to rest 20 feet lower, tilted at a drunken angle, its porch torn completely off. One of the fleeing cabin owners, his car slipping and sliding on the ruined road, caught the whole thing on his dashcam. The video was all over the news by morning. The Lakeview Club Estates didn't die in a single, explosive moment. It dissolved. By dawn, the entire development was an impassable swamp of mud and tilted, broken buildings. The HOA collapsed overnight as homeowners panicked, their investments literally sinking into the ground. As for Thomas Ridge, he was gone. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't answer his phone. He just disappeared. The rain stopped, but the quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet than I'd ever known on my land. For 13 months, it was a silence of neglect. For the past few weeks, it had been a roar of construction. Now, it was the sound of nature slowly reclaiming its own. The angry whine of saws and the rumble of trucks were gone, replaced by the chorus of frogs from the wetlands and the call of a hawk circling overhead. From my porch, the view was a strange monument to greed. 193 cabins, tilted and stained, sat silent in a landscape of mud and ruin. They looked like gravestones in a forgotten cemetery. The county's full stop work order was now the least of their problems. Condemnation notices, printed on bright orange paper, were nailed to the door of every single structure. They weren't just non-compliant anymore, they were officially declared uninhabitable. The story, as stories like this tend to do, took on a life of its own. It started with a single article in the local paper, accompanied by the dashcam footage of the sliding cabin. The headline read, "Man in Coma returns to find HOA built illegal resort on his land." Within a week, it was picked up by state news, and then national outlets. My phone, which had been silent for over a year, began to ring constantly. I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in being a celebrity. I was interested in justice. And justice, it turned out, was coming from all directions. 2 men in dark suits showed up at my door one morning. They weren't from a news station, they were from the FBI. They were polite, professional, and had a lot of questions about Thomas Ridge and the county clerk. My binder, "Before You Say It's Legal," became their roadmap. They were opening a federal investigation into wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy related to the forged deeds and notarizations. The local Good Old Boy network that had allowed Ridge to operate was about to face a level of scrutiny they had never imagined. The wheels of federal justice turn slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. A few days later, a lawyer representing a group of the cabin owners contacted me. He wanted to make it very clear that they were filing a massive class action lawsuit, but my name was not on it. Their suit was against Thomas Ridge, his LLC, his business partners, and the county for gross negligence. I wasn't the villain in their story. I was their star witness. They had been sold a lie, and they were going to make the man who sold it to them pay. Ridge himself was still nowhere to be found. He had vanished, leaving a trail of financial ruin and broken dreams behind him. But he wouldn't be able to run forever, not with the FBI looking for him. The biggest change, however, happened closer to home. At the next county commission meeting, a new ordinance was passed. They called it the Langston Mandate. It was a simple but powerful new rule. Any land transfer or deed modification involving a property owner who is medically incapacitated now requires verification from a court-appointed guardian and a secondary review by a state-level auditor. The loophole Ridge had exploited was slammed shut, sealed with concrete and rebar. My fight had done more than just save my own land. It had protected others. 3 weeks after the storm, with the legal battles now in the hands of others, I sat at my dining room table with Casey and a woman from a local land trust. In front of me was a document. It was a conservation easement. It wasn't a deed. I wasn't selling my land. I was making a permanent promise. By signing it, I was ensuring that my 400 acres could never be developed. Ever. The forests would be protected, the wetlands preserved, and the reservoir would remain a sanctuary for wildlife. No future Thomas Ridge could ever come along and try to pave over this piece of peace. It would be wild and free long after I was gone. I looked at Casey. The worried lines around her eyes had started to soften. She had her father back, and we had our land back. She smiled and pushed the pen toward me. My hand was steady as I signed my name, my real signature, with the straight, uncurled L's. A profound sense of peace washed over me. The fight was truly over. The land was safe. I went to sleep a builder, a man who shaped the land to his will. I woke up a witness, a man who watched it get stolen. And in the end, I let the water speak for me. I looked out the window, at the reservoir shimmering in the afternoon sun, at the tops of the distant, silent cabins being slowly overgrown by vines. People say, you can't fight City Hall. Maybe not. But as an engineer, I know a more fundamental truth. You can't vote against gravity. Justice doesn't always wear a badge or a black robe. Sometimes it wears rubber boots and carries a damn key.